Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar, Open University.
Hello students, welcome back to the early cinema that we are going to do for this course. Now when we talk about early cinema, we will have to understand that cinema can be seen as two phases. So when we move on to the early cinematic phase, when films started getting made at a certain point of time, and we'll talk about that time, then there were certain kinds of films made which were then exhibited for public viewing. So people would pay money to come and watch films. But these were very different kinds of films than what we watch today. So when we look at early cinema, we'll have to look at it a bit differently, because early cinema is very different from the kind of films that we watch today. The second thing that we need to understand is that early cinema also experimented quite a lot because it was a new medium. So just like any new medium, people were not very sure how a film is going to work, what kind of films people are going to like, what are the different kinds of things that goes into filmmaking. So there was a lot of experimentation in early cinema. Now remember, there was no sound in those films. So the only thing that could be captured was pictures and movement. So all the early films that you watch now, they are all available on YouTube, and I'm sure that many of you will go back and watch those YouTube videos, which I'm going to talk about during this talk. Then you will notice that these early films were very, very different from the kind of films that we watch today. The third thing that we must remember about early cinema is that this kind of a cinema came from industrial production. So there was a huge amount of industrial revolution that happened around the late 18th, 19th century in Europe, in the West. And because of this industrial revolution, cinema was a part of that industrial revolution. Cinema was a part of the experience of industrial revolution. So the capture of moving images in cinema was an important aspect, therefore, of how early films were made, because it was a part of the larger industrial morale, the industrial rationale of that period. So when we see early cinema, either in India or in the West, where cinema developed, then we must understand that this form of cinema is very different. So I want to emphasize this point before we move on to the actual looking at early cinema, the actual viewing of early cinema, etc. So that part of cinema needs to be kept in mind. Okay? So what do we see in early cinema? Now, before we go into what we see in early cinema, we must remember that from the 17th century onwards, there was quite a lot of experimentation with moving images. So it was not something new. So when we say that cinema is absolutely new or something very revolutionary or something that was path-breaking, well, they were all of these in their own ways. But remember that moving images, or what we call natural magic, so the magic of cinema, is already present from very early times. Now, one of the examples of such production of moving images, or the illusion of moving images, can be traced back to what was known as catoptric theatre. So what was catoptric theatre? Now, as you can see in the image over here, this was basically a cabinet. So it was a wooden cabinet with a lot of reflecting mirrors inside. So people were asked to look into the cabinet with reflecting mirrors, with different sorts of photographic images there, and the mirrors would be moved, and it will produce a semblance of movement, and people would actually pay to do this. This was in the 17th century started mainly by Jesuit priests who would carry this instrument along with them and then show it to the audiences. So when we look at early history of moving images, it is not really cinema that began it. There were many other instruments that came before cinema which experimented with the idea of moving images. Cinema, of course, did something else, and we'll talk about that something else later. But when we look at moving images, it has a long history. So a large number of people tried to do things through these moving images because they gave thrills, they were funny, they could be monetized, so people could pay money, and people actually became rich by using these instruments, by showing them in fairs, festivals, in exhibitions, etc. So one of the earliest examples of such a moving image or a moving image apparatus or a moving image instrument was this catoptric theatre. Now, along with this catoptric theatre, there were they were sometimes called peep shows. So people would peep because you had to kind of peep into the cabinet like this to see. So they were sometimes called peep shows. And there were many other inventions or discoveries that happened along the way before we come into films. So we need to look at that history a bit in order to understand what was happening in early cinema. In the 17th century again, there was something called the Ross Wheel of Life. Now, what was the Ross Wheel of Life? If you have heard about the magic lantern, then the magic lantern was something that could reflect images onto a screen. Okay? And this is what a magic lantern looked like. As you can see that there are two different aspects to it. Light would be passed through the hole that you see in the picture over there, and when they rotated, when these two discs rotated, they would start throwing up images onto a wall or a screen or a canvas which was placed before it, and it would produce this flickering images of things happening on the screen, etc. Now, again, this was an attempt to produce visual images onto an external object. The same thing that films do. So it produces visual images onto an external object. And this is what early instruments like this tried to do. So there was a lot of experimentation with visual images. So when we look at visual images, when we think of films today, it is not something that is absolutely new. So there was a huge amount of historical evidence that people had experimented with this quite a lot. With the Ross Wheel of Life, or the magic lantern as it was called, lantern because it looked like a light, and then when it was rotated, you could see images onto the screen. Yeah. If you move on, if you come 200 years later, so from 17th century to 19th century, you also have examples of, let's say, shadow theatre. And I'm sure that many of you might have watched shadow theatre. It is still a very popular art form. You must have watched puppet theatre, which is sometimes used as shadow theatre, where the puppets are used to create shadows. And of course, you had the kinetoscope. Now, let me tell you briefly about the shadow theatre. And the shadow theatre was something that, as you can see in the picture over here, was actually acted out by actors behind a screen, which was lit from behind. So you could not see the actors, but you could see the different sorts of things that the actors were doing. Sometimes through their hands, sometimes through their mouth, sometimes using their bodies, in such a way that it produced different sorts of images onto the screen. So the shadow theatre was very popular again in mostly fairs and exhibitions and popular places where there would be, in a small village, for example, people would gather together and there would be a shadow theatre. And there were expert artists who used to perform these shadow theatres because they were trained in how to produce the shadow theatre. Now, shadow theatre is very interesting because it involved actors. Sometimes it would have music which accompanied it, but it did not show the actors. It actually showed the bodies of the actors through a certain kind of a light. And those bodies then were projected onto a screen, which would then tell a story through, it might be any kind of a story, which was then narrated through these shadows. So this is almost like a film. This is almost like what you watch in films. So films, when you watch films today, they are mostly, metaphorically speaking, shadows. So they are shadows in that sense. So you can't touch them, you can't smell them, etc. And the only difference, of course, is that you have a lot of music, you have a lot of dialogues in these films, etc. In shadow theater, this was mostly done through bodily movements. So this is one of the precursors of films. The second image that you see over here is that of what is known as a kinetoscope. Now, kinetoscope is something that is associated with the great American inventor Thomas Alva Edison, and sometimes it was called Edison's kinetograph. And as you can see in the instrument, we'll not go into the technical aspects of the instrument, but it had the capability, if you passed electricity through it, then to produce moving images. In fact, Edison himself shot quite a lot of films using his kinetograph. And many of these films are available on YouTube. So if you just type in a search for Edison kinetograph or Edison early films, then you will see there are quite a few films available over there. One of the most famous films that is shown on YouTube is a film called Black Diamond Express. So if you get a chance, it's a very, very short film which shows a train approaching and workers are working on the railway line. When the train approaches, the workers move out, the train passes, and then the workers come back to the railway line. Okay, that's the film. There is no story or anything. So it's the capturing of a train passing through a railway track. And this was mostly done through the technique of Edison's kinetograph. So the possibility of capturing movement, of capturing moving images, is something that came into existence with newer developments in industrial technology. So as industrial technology started developing, started becoming much more refined, started progressing in a certain direction, then what you have is that the possibility of filmmaking also started increasing. And Edison's kinetograph is one of the earliest examples of such an important invention that could capture moving images, that could capture in such a way that the image almost seemed lifelike, almost real. So realism or reality can now be captured and then showed a number of times. So you can repeat reality now. So that is one of the important aspects of early cinema or early films. So what you can now do is, let's say, capture factory workers leaving a factory and then keep on showing it across different fairs, exhibitions, etc. People are willing to pay for it, so you can now monetize it, you can make money out of it, etc. So the possibility of any industrial technology also depends on whether you can market it, because if it's a technology that cannot be marketed, then it is not a very useful industrial technology. And kinetograph showed that such kind of instruments or such kind of technology can be used to produce a film going market where people are ready to pay to watch a film. And that is one of the important contributions of early cinema. So industrial technology on the one hand, where you have people who are inventing, who are making new devices to capture reality of a certain kind, of a train or anything, and then also using it to market it. So what you have is industrial technology on the one hand and aesthetics on the other hand. So aesthetics, if you remember in the first lecture that we talked about, was about the nature of beauty, proportion, where do you place the camera, how many characters are going to come inside the camera frame, etc. So all that aspects now combine with industrial technology and then produce what we now today called the film. Yeah? So let's see what happens with this new industrial technology. Now, the picture that you see on the screen over here is actually one of the first movie cameras that is invented by two brothers. I'll tell you about the story about these two brothers, and this is known as a cinematograph. Okay? So this is one of the earliest movie cameras that you can see. So this camera was used to capture many of the early films that these two brothers that I talked about made. Now, as you can see in this image, there is a box out there which contains the film, but there is a long lens which captures the image. And once it captures the image, it is recorded onto the film that is there, the reel that is inside there in the box. And then, of course, you can play the box, so you can rotate the film at a certain speed in such a way that the images that are captured on the reel almost look like they are moving. So remember, there are series of images that are captured in the film inside the box. But because of the rotation, the movement of the reel in a certain direction at a certain speed, that you start looking at it as a film, as if the images are moving, as if there is a constant movement in the images. So that is what starts happening during this period. Now, who are these two brothers that I mentioned? Now, they are popularly known in the history of films as Lumiere brothers, and their names were Auguste and Louis Lumiere. Now, they have an interesting story because Auguste and Louis Lumiere's father used to own a factory in France which used to make films, which used to make photographic films. Okay? And they were a very successful factory, they were a very successful company. And the two brothers decided to create an apparatus or to create a certain kind of a machine which could use these films, these photographic films that the factory produced, in order to capture moving images. And this is where films began. Okay? In fact, the first film that Lumiere brothers shot was in 1895. There is a bit of a debate in film history about which is the first film that was made. But nowadays, more or less, many people have agreed that it's the Lumiere brothers films that were first exhibited, and therefore they can be credited with making the first film. In fact, the first film that they made was actually a film about workers leaving their own factory. The film is available on YouTube. So if you type Lumiere brothers and workers leaving factory, the film is there and you can watch it. And this film was made in 1895. Now, 1895 is an important date for film studies, and 1895 is an important date for film history, because 1895 is taken as the date when films, as we know it today, began. And it is credited to Lumiere brothers, who first made a film of people moving out of a factory. So now you have a film mechanism where you can capture movement, and you can capture movement for a long time and then show it to people. So you can preserve it and then show it to people. The Lumiere brothers, of course, became extremely famous. They made quite a lot of films. They became extremely famous, and their exhibition of films was so important that people would flock. In fact, there are stories that there would be 1.5 mile long queues to see Lumiere brothers films. In fact, Lumiere brothers themselves never thought that what they did would become so popular. In fact, there is evidence to show that Lumiere brothers themselves didn't want to continue to make films. But because films became so popular, because people wanted to watch them, see them, because it was absolutely something new, they never imagined that on a screen or on a canvas or on a wall where the film is projected, things will start moving. They were used to, of course, photographs, and they were used to, different sorts of things like shadow theater, etc. But they were not used to something real, life, which is captured on screen and then projected onto the screen. So this was something very new for people. And Lumiere brothers, of course, became extremely important, therefore, in the history of film studies, because they showed that real life now can be captured, it can be projected, it can be shown, and people are willing to pay for it. Okay? So it became a perfect industrial mechanism. So remember, as I told you, industrial technology depends on its use, but also on the profits and the different sorts of monetization that it generates. So filmmaking was not simply an invention for aesthetic aspects, but it also had a commercial possibility. And that was an important aspect of filmmaking, because you are making films and you can make money out of it. So there is a commercial aspect to films. Yeah? So one of the early films that is again available on YouTube, and you you can go and watch on YouTube, is a film called Arrival of a Train at La Ciotat, which was made in 1896. And what you see in this film is, probably you won't even call it a film today. You might call it a documentary, or you might call it just a shot of a certain thing that is happening. So what happens in the film, and do watch it please, is that a train arrives at a station called La Ciotat. People get out of the train, people get inside the train, and the train leaves. That's all. That's the entire film. So as you can imagine, it was, let's say, a 30-second film, 45-second film, a maximum 1-minute film. So these early films that were made were mostly very short ones, primarily because the technology was not developed enough to make very long films. And therefore, it was simply a shot of a certain event that was happening. It was simply a shot of, let's say, a train coming or a train leaving, or Edison, for example, made a film on an elephant standing on an electric plate and being electrocuted. So all sorts of films were getting made, but they were all very, very short in nature. So they would be 1 minute, 1.5 minutes, 2 minutes. Now remember, if I am showing a film which is 1.5 minutes and I'm telling people that, okay, you have to pay for this, then not many people are going to come. Of course, it is very new, very novel, very interesting, but how many people are going to come just for 1.5 minutes to pay? So films were always part of a larger program, and we'll talk about it in greater details as we go along. So what happened in these early films? So what was really going on? Now, if you look at early films, especially in the West, and here there lies a difference between Western early films and Indian early films. So if you look at Western films during this period, let's say 1895 onwards, then you have industrial technology producing modern industrial life. So that is what films are doing. So the examples that I gave you till now is that, let's say, factory workers leaving a factory. So you have an industry and industrial technology, and you show industrial life through that industrial technology. So film was an industrial technology, and it is showing industry. It is showing a factory. Similarly, a train coming to the station, an industrial technology, that is a camera, a film camera, showing another industrial technology, a train coming. Okay. So if you look at these early films, it's very interesting how industrial technology is kind of repeated in the image itself. So you have trains, you have factories, you have cars, you have electrocution, and most of the early films were about trains, because trains were the perfect example of movement, because you could capture movement when the trains were coming. So what you have is a very interesting things happening. So what we understand by films today as stories, as acting, as dramatic, etc., was not there. It was simply industrial technology mimicking another form of industrial technology, or industrial technology capturing another form of industrial technology. So this is how early films began. Now, there are a large number of stories that have been told where it is told that when audiences first came and watched, for example, arrival of a train in a station, there are huge number of stories which tell you that audiences were terrified, they were shocked, women who were pregnant, miscarried. So there are all sorts of legendary stories that are associated with early films. And these stories came into existence much later, after the early film period was over. So the early film spectator, the early film audience, was seen as absolutely overwhelmed by the films. So they were seen as people who would definitely kind of look at these films. They had never seen anything like it. And then they would obviously look at these films and see something very new, something very novel. And they would be so overwhelmed that they would run away from the theater, terrified that the train is going to come and hit them, or the train is going to do something, etc. So there are lots of these stories. Now, these stories are very interesting in themselves, but if you think about them, then I have already told you, and that's why the history of the early films is important. I've already told you that people were quite used to it. So remember, they had already seen shadow theatre. They had already probably seen kinetoscope. They had already probably seen the magic lantern. Okay. And remember, this is also the period, the end of the 19th century, 1890s, where there is a lot of industrial technology that is used, for example, in circuses, in exhibitions. So you had, for example, the roller coaster ride, which gives you thrills. So people were used to thrills. So all these stories about people running away from the theater after watching the film, or women miscarrying after watching a film, seems to be, does not seem to have much evidence behind it. So what was really happening over here? So what is really happening is, we need to understand these early films were also a part of a larger history of thrill making in modern times. So as modernity starts developing, it starts industrializing, and with the coming of the modern age, the kind of life that people lead, for example, they have to get up at 6 in the morning, they have to go to a factory, they have to go to an office, they have to come back and have a very boring life, etc. They are looking for thrills outside this mundane life, outside this regular boring life. So they are ready to pay for these kind of thrills. So they would go to a circus, for example, to be thrilled, where a tiger or a lion or an elephant charges at them. They would go to a roller coaster ride to experience the thrill of roller coasters. And this is all made possible by industrial technology. So industry not only gives you jobs and boredom at times, but also provides you with the thrills, with the amusement, with the entertainment that can take you away from this boredom. And that is an important aspect of early films. So early films should be seen as something that is providing that thrill that is available through other mediums like roller coasters or other kind of things that people used to do. And films, therefore, early films, people are ready to pay because they want to be thrilled. They want to be amused. They want to be entertained. Because what modernity has done to the West, or to the Western life, is that it has produced boredom. So you are so bored with your daily life because you have to do the same things over and over and over again. And you must watch a Charlie Chaplin film called Modern Times to understand, where this man keeps on tightening the same nuts and bolts every day without really doing anything else in his life. So do watch Modern Times, please, to understand what industrial technology could do to people. So in order to get out of that boredom, to that same thing happening day after day after day, you need different kinds of amusements, different kinds of entertainments. So film was one of those entertainments that was provided to them. So it could be seen as a modern aesthetic of thrills. So it is beautiful, it is good to watch. You go and sit in a theater, you go and watch it, and you enjoy it, you are amused by it, but it also produces a thrill in you. So that is how early films began. It was in a long line of thrill-making technology that was available in the West. Films was one of them. So it was a continuation of early mechanisms to produce a certain kind of a spectacle. So film was a kind of a spectacle that you watch. Film is something that you enjoy because it is providing something new to you. And because it is providing something new, if I keep on showing films to you, which are trains and factories and things like this, you're going to get bored. So I need to find something else. I need to show you films that are different so that you can keep on coming back and watching films again and again. And that is how films developed. So if I kept on showing the same thing again and again, you will be bored, right? It will be same like your life, which is boring. So what you do then is, through films, you experiment with films. You try doing different things with films, so that more audiences come back. So you don't show the same thing again and again. Initially it works, but after the initial thrill is gone, obviously you need something new, something more, etc. Now, as I said, these films are very small, they're very short films. They were like 1 minute, 1.5 minutes maximum. So people were not ready to pay only for a film. So what used to happen was, films were part of a larger program. So the program would, let's say, begin with singing, then followed by an opera, then followed by a magic show, then followed by something else, let's say a musical program, and then at the end of this entire thing, you will have a film show. Okay? So films were always, in these early stages at least, were always a part of a larger program of production. So films were never shown as we see it today. So when we go to a theater today, when we go to watch a film today, we generally go there, buy a ticket, get into the screen, and then watch the film and walk out, have some food and go back home. But that was not what the early film experience was. The early film experience was a composite experience. It was a combined experience. You can even call it a compound experience. So when you go to watch a film, you know that you're going to watch a film, but the film is not the only thing that you are going to watch. So you will watch a lot of other things and then you watch a film. The most interesting thing is sometimes to make people understand what the film was doing, you had even a lecturer. So the films will be showed, they will be screened, and then you will also have a lecturer who will explain what is happening in the film and sometimes even comment on the film, sometimes even raise the expectations of the audience by saying, now you're going to watch a great event, now a train is going to come rushing at you, etc., etc. So these lecturers often accompanied films and explain what the film is doing. So in order to understand early cinema experience, the kind of experience that spectators had, or the kind of experience that people used to go for, then you need to understand that films were never seen as singular monolithic entities. Film was a part of a larger program, and that is how people enjoyed it. Yeah? So in other words, these early films could be called the cinema of attractions. And this is a term that a very famous film scholar called Tom Gunning uses. So he uses two terms. He calls it either the cinema of attractions or what he calls the cinema of instants. So what is cinema of attractions? So here the major aesthetic quality of early film was based on how much of thrill and attraction can it produce. So the more thrill the film has, the more attraction it has, the more people will come and watch the film. It was also a cinema of instants. Instant is a moment, a small part of time. It is also a cinema of instants because it captured only a very minuscule part of time. So as I gave you the examples, if you remember, the factory workers leaving the factory, or the train arriving at a station, or a train crossing through. These are very small parts of time that are captured. So these are cinema of instants. So you wouldn't expect a story in these very early films. You would simply see an instant, you would see a minute, you would see a small event happening in a very small scale of time. Just like it would attract you. So it is also a cinema of attractions. It is because it provides you with this idea of the train coming, that you're waiting for the train to come. You're waiting, you're attracted towards that image of the train coming towards you or rushing towards you, etc. And that provides you with the thrill. Now, one of the things that we must realize is that though we think that early cinema is gone now, we have different kinds of films now, and the kind of filmmaking now is very different from early cinema, it's not true really, because you can see the examples of cinema of instants even today. So think of a science fiction film or a horror film. If you are interested in any of these kinds of films, then you will notice that even in science fiction films, sometimes you are attracted, you are thrilled by certain things, right? So a science fiction shows you, let's say, a computer or an alien, and you are really thrilled by that instant of watching it. So the cinema of instants comes back in different ways in different kinds of films that are made today. Horror films completely depend on the idea of the cinema of instants, because horror can be created if I can thrill you, if I can shock you, if I can appall you in a certain way. And that is created through this very minuscule moment when For example, a ghost suddenly comes or a horrifying figure suddenly emerges. And this almost is like the cinema of instance, just like the train coming to the station suddenly and people getting thrilled out of it. Similarly, in today's film, if you watch a big spaceship appearing out of nowhere in science fiction film, or a big horrifying creature appearing out of nowhere in a horror film, then you notice that it's almost like a cinema of instant. You're thrilled. You are. There is a certain kind of aesthetic to it. So that is what happens in these kind of films. So it's not that early cinema is gone. Early cinema still continues in different kinds of forms in today's films. So now after this early cinema, as I told you, what you have is also the possibility. Now remember, if I show you the same thing again and again, then obviously you're going to get very bored. You're not going to be very happy with paying money for seeing the same thing. Trains coming to a station or factory workers leaving a factory is not going to, no, it's not good. It's going to become very boring after a point of time. So in the second stage of early cinema, and we are still in early cinema, people realized that you needed something else. Okay. And one of the most important figures of this second stage of filmmaking is a person called Georges Méliès. What does Méliès do? Méliès realizes, but before we come into what he does, I must tell you what Méliès did before he started making films. Méliès was the owner of what is known as magic theatre. Okay, so he used to produce theatre which used to have a lot of magic in it. For example, a character standing on the stage will suddenly disappear through a trick, or there will be a smoke in the middle of the stage and the character completely vanishes in that smoke, etc. Yeah? So he used to do magic theatre, and that is how you used to earn his livelihood. So when Méliès started thinking about making films, he thought that why not use the elements of magic theatre into films themselves. So one of the things that he started doing was he realized that in order to bring theatre into films, you need a story. So you just can't have a train coming and going because there is no story to it. And therefore he started thinking in terms of making longer films, not like just 1 minute films or 1.5 minute films. So Méliès started thinking in terms of creating a film which at least has a story. Okay. So one of the early films that he made in 1902 was a film called A Trip to the Moon. So the image that you see over here is an image from that film. Now, A Trip to the Moon is a very interesting film. It's again available on YouTube. Please watch it on YouTube. Now, the film is about scientists who decide to go to moon and come back. And the film is based on these scientists who make a rocket, and then they ride the rocket to the moon. And when the rocket lands onto the moon, this is the picture that you see. It lands in the eye of the moon, and moon is not very happy with the rocket landing on its eye, etc. So it's quite funny, it's quite comic, it's quite satirical. But at the same time, it's almost like the first science fiction film ever made, or first fantasy film ever made. Now, Méliès himself was very interested in science, very interested in science fiction, and he was very influenced by science fiction writers like Jules Verne, who was a French science fiction writer. And he believed that a film should be made on these kind of aspects. So not only does Méliès introduce narrative or story, so the story is the scientists make a rocket, go to the moon and meet a lot of aliens on the moon, and then the aliens attack them, but then they finally manage to leave that place and capture one of the aliens and bring them back to their place in Paris. So that's the story. It's a very basic story, but at least you have now the beginnings of story in films. The second thing that Méliès also realized was that in order to make a long story, you have to cut it into small parts if you're going to make it into a film, because a film is not like writing where you can keep on writing. Films are composed of shots, scenes, and sequences. So you need to create different shots, you need to create different scenes, and then you need to combine all those scenes together to form a sequence. So Méliès is often credited with introducing what we call editing techniques today. And these editing techniques are very, very important, because without editing, we won't be able to understand what we understand by films today. Okay, so editing is an integral part of filmmaking today. And what Méliès did was introduce editing. So you must have heard the word cut. So when a director says action and camera and roll, and then when the shooting is done, you say cut. So cut is basically an editing technique where you cut the reel and then you attach it with something else. So you cut and put it together with another scene, etc. And this was probably introduced by Méliès. There is again a bit of a debate on that, but Méliès was one of the earliest to produce editing techniques for films. And he was also one of the earliest ones to produce or introduce special effects. So when you watch the film A Trip to the Moon, you will see that he uses a lot of special effects that he learned from his Magic Theatre. So Magic Theatre used a lot of special effects, as I told you, and those special effects were then transferred onto films, and the films produced special effects. He was also one of the earliest to introduce genres like fantasy and science fiction. So before that, films were mostly about industrial life, as I have told you. But now you can have stories in fantasy and science fiction. So Méliès is a very important figure in early film studies, in early cinema. And if you are interested, do watch a film called Hugo, Hugo, which is based on Méliès' life. Well, not entirely, but you can watch the film to understand what Méliès did with filmmaking. So let's now move on to early Indian cinema, and that is where I'm going to do a comparison between Western early cinema and Indian early cinema. And one of the earliest people who started making films, though he's not the first one, was of course the famous Dhundiraj Govind Phalke, more popularly known as Dadasaheb Phalke. And one of the earliest films that he made was of course Raja Harishchandra in 1913. Now look at the difference between early Indian cinema and early Western cinema. Now Dadasaheb Phalke, one of the earliest films that he made was actually about a plant growing. So he put seeds in a flower pot and then he kept on watering it and he kept on filming it. So one of the earliest films that he makes actually is the plant growing from a seed to a big plant. Now it's interesting that he's not interested, like in the West, of showing industrial life. He is more interested in showing natural, organic life or nature. So nature becomes an important aspect of Dadasaheb Phalke's film. We are going to talk about Phalke in greater details later, but in our next unit. But also remember, one of the major differences that Dadasaheb Phalke or early filmmakers had with the Western filmmakers was they hugely drew on Indian mythology, primarily from the stories of Ramayana, from Mahabharata, from the Puranas, and many of these early stories that were readily available to almost all creative artists in India. They drew from this pool of stories to make their films. So the first film, Raja Harishchandra, of course, is based on these early mythologicals. And therefore, some of the early Indian films, still about 1920s and 30s, you see are mostly based on mythologies, mostly based on myths and other stories that are available in the Indian tradition. And many of these films were very successful, etc. In fact, Dadasaheb Phalke himself made quite a lot of mythologicals during his career as a filmmaker. So, as I said, it draws on a more organic view of films. So, the film is something that is related to your cultural context. Films are something that are related to your organic, natural, historical context. And that is how Indian filmmaking began as a kind of a contrast to Western filmmaking, if you can see it as a contrast. So, Indian filmmaking, therefore, used an industrial mechanism to produce a cultural aesthetic. So the focus of Indian filmmakers was not so much on producing industrial aesthetic, but to produce a certain kind of a cultural aesthetic. And that was an important aspect of early Indian cinema. To conclude, therefore, we need to understand that when early cinema began, it began with a certain kind of industrial technology. And this industrial technology, at least in the West, kept on repeating the industrial technology or the reality of industrial technology that is outside in the world. So the early films that you see, at least the early cinema that you see in the West, is all about repeating or capturing the industrial technology that is outside in a certain reality outside in modern world. In the case of Indian cinema, of course, we can see that there is a certain kind of a difference, because the idea is not to capture modern life, the idea is not to capture modern industrial technology, but to create a certain kind of a cultural, historical aesthetic. So thank you very much again for listening to this unit, and we'll meet again.